setting up our meeting.
Wow, I think we're
We're live.
live. Wow, that's great. And gosh, it's so great to be back again with Christina and with Emma. And to everybody out there, it's great to see you. This is True Play check-in number 4. And just to give a little background, because we may have new people joining us, we certainly hope so. We'll do our best to answer questions as they come up if we can. Really, these True Play check-ins are an extension of conversations that we just have together as a group, as colleagues. If you were able to join us last week, Dr. Denisha Jones, before that, Elizabeth Tam, and before that, Emma, who we've got back with us again today. It's really what we do, you know, we get together, we reflect on our work together, and we just wanted to share that with other educators and parents and anyone out there, really. And so, you know, these are really minimally structured, open-ended conversations. We talk about minimal structure and open-endedness is kind of a principle in Anji Play, not only in the design of materials and environments, but, you know, giving space and time for children to pursue their interests, not putting too much in terms of the teacher's demands, you know, giving teachers times to reflect on a regular basis. And so we don't have a script. And so if we go off script, that's kind of what we're doing. And I think if you were here last week with us, with Denisha, you know, it was a really joyous, deeply engaged, reflective conversation. And so in Anji Play, we talk about love and risk and joy and engagement and reflection. And so we know that we're doing it right when that is what our conversations together look like as well. And so, you know, we're taking risks by talking live. I just saw our good friend Suzanne Axelson talking about an interview she's about to give. And she said, I've got so many thoughts. It'd be interesting to see what bubbles to the surface first. And so, you know, we take that risk and putting out our thinking, being joyously engaged. And, you know, these will be available always for free here on Facebook. We want everybody to have access to these. And, you know, we encourage everyone to come and check out our website. And I kind of wanted to put that out there because for us, you know, we're out here talking about the work of Ms. Chung and Anji, about the teachers, the educators that are doing this work, both in China and in pilot programs around the world. And we often see posts that talk about the material environments or the sort of formal aspects of the approach. They say, okay, you know, we're doing Anji Play in our school, we just need more materials, or we're doing Anji, we're doing something just like this, we've always done something like this, all we need is these ladders. And I think that, you know, what we should really think about is going beyond what we see on the surface and really looking at our own practice and reflecting on what it means to listen to children. And, you know, something that we see, and Ms. Chung and I, and certainly Christina, who's with us, has been a teacher for over a decade, and Emma's a very experienced teacher. We go to play-based programs around the world, and we don't see what we're describing. You know, you see some play, you see some pretty materials, but what you don't see is you don't see children's stories being listened to first and being taken as the primary basis for learning. And so if you go into a site, if you go into a center and you're seeing lesson plans, if you're seeing projects that are being developed by the teachers based on their observations, if you see complex schema of sort of where the children's thinking is based on the teacher's analysis, you're getting further and further away from the needs of the child, the story of the child being reflected in the day-to-day life of the child in the school. And so really, you know, we talk about love, and love in many ways is also defined, we think of it as safety. And safety for us, and I think it may be funny for a lot of people to think of an approach that has a lot of physical risk for us to focus in on safety. And when we think of safety, we think of it really broadly defined. Safety that comes from materials that are sturdy, that are well taken care of, environments that don't have hazards in them. But safety is also about being trusted, being listened to. It's both the child being trusted and listened to, it's also the teacher being trusted and listened to. But that begins with the knowledge of the child leading the direction of decisions that are made in the school setting. And so when a child has that opportunity to have their experience heard and seen, for their story to come first before we layer on our decisions about what they need, right? And children are incredibly sophisticated at negotiating and trying to understand what our needs are for them. And so when we have needs about what they should learn or what they should be doing, children feel that. And that's not necessarily a safe place for a child to be. And it's a common practice in much of play-based learning across the world. I have a desire for you to learn this. I want to take your thoughts and make it into a synthesis that you can then study from. I want you to discover this idea. I want you to hear me. And so what we're talking about in this approach, in this theory, this philosophy, is what it looks like for us to really listen to children's needs, to provide the safety of listening to what children need in their own learning, in their own inquiry, and their own exploration. And it's something that we don't actually see that often. And we're lucky because we have, again, Emma Pickering, who's the early years lead at the British International School in Budapest, who about a month ago shared with us what it was looking like going back to sort of reopening her school. And now she's about a month into that process. And I think, Emma, I don't want to speak for you, but I think that question of safety and listening has been critical in this last month. So we just love to hear your thoughts on that process. What's going on for you? And really anything you want to share.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I hope everybody's well and is navigating their own situations, because obviously we're all emerging into very different situations. And our reality was that we actually opened on the 11th of May. So it's actually a little bit more than 4 weeks now. And we had to go through like a phased reopening. So I just want to kind of share like what we focused on in that process. And one of our key things that we looked at was, what does the government say? We had to really look at what the legalities were for our reopening, because that's kind of your starting point. Like what is possible legally from the perspective in Budapest, in Hungary. And then from there, we kind of looked at what's going on across our organization, because we're lucky to be part of a wider organization. So I was able to speak to a colleague called Alex over in Prague. And Alex and I talked for a really long time the week before we reopened. And he was so insightful because they'd actually been open about 2 weeks already. So he was able to share with me his process, and he was able to share with me the health and safety protocols that they'd gone through. And then we kind of looked at those, and then we looked at our context, and it was kind of this dance between what they were doing, what other schools in our wider organization were doing, what the government here was saying. And then from there, we started to look at like, well, what do we as a school believe is safe? So what's our perspective? So we brought that into the discussion as well. And we had a lot of really, really in-depth discussions around protocols and health and safety. And then from there, the next step was to really look at, well, what's right for children? We can talk about health and safety. We can talk about wearing masks. We can talk about social distancing. We can talk about all of these things that are going around in circles, in conversations. And it's not to say that these things aren't important, but to us, it was the children that are most important. And we really wanted to make our focus what the children need. The children are emerging from these really unique situations. Some children are emerging from situations where they've had full parental support at home with their kind of virtual learning that's been happening for them. They've had their parents there guiding them through the whole process, supporting them with their schedule, supporting them with their daily routine. But then you've also got these children who have 2 working parents at home that haven't had that level of kind of scaffold around their daily routine, and they've had to do a lot of things for themselves. So, and then you've got children also that are just really ready to be back at school and are just super excited to be back in a social context with friends. So it's so multi-layered. We had to really think very deeply about what do these children need that are coming from all of these different emerging contexts. And one of the things that we really thought about is, that safety for children is not social distancing. So we had a really clear decision from the beginning that we would not be enforcing social distancing for our 3 to 5-year-old children. So then from there, we had to really think very carefully about, well, if we're not socially distancing 3 to 5-year-olds, what does that mean in terms of safety? What can we do to make those children as safe as we can possibly make them? So we decided to kind of look at the model of working in pods. So our first phase of reopening is that we opened pods of 5. So children were in pods of 5 with 1 adult leading that pod of 5. And one of the next stages that we had to go through was creating those environments for those children, because obviously we're coming from a situation where our centre in Budapest is one big open plan centre. And we knew very quickly that we weren't going to be able to function all of our pods in that space. So we had to really think very deeply about which spaces we could use in the school, which spaces would be appropriate for 3 to 5-year-old children, or which spaces we could make appropriate for 3 to 5-year-old children. So we had to move materials around, we had to share resources, we had to really kind of take a lot of time but also a lot of consideration and thought about which materials to place where. So something we also looked at was who's in that group. What were those children interested in before the school closed? What were those children talking about while we were discussing their play virtually together during our Zoom sessions? And that helped us to kind of guide the process of selecting materials for those different pods that we were creating. And when we first reopened, we only actually had 20 spaces. So we were only actually allowed to open with 20 children on site. And that was quite complicated because, like, which 20 children do you take? So we really had to just survey the parents on a first come, first serve basis. So we kind of sent out a survey to find out who would be interested. And our perspective was really that, we're going to be undersubscribed. You know, we're not even going to fill those 20 spaces. Parents are going to want to keep their child at home. You know, we're still right in the middle of a pandemic. It's not like the situation has suddenly become safe. But we were surprised, and we had more than 20 children that wanted to come back to school. So we had to think about how to phase those children in a gradual way and how to support families with that. And I think we were surprised that so many wanted to come back. And it was quite interesting, really, because we wanted to explore, like, what are the families' reasons for wanting to come back? Like, that was kind of interesting to us. And again, that was so diverse in terms of why families wanted their child back at school. For some, it was an urgent need because both parents had to return to work, because at this point in time, around the 11th of May, there were offices and things reopening around Budapest. So some families were returning back to the office and really needed the support for childcare. And then we had families who, two parents working, but working from home, and just finding it really difficult to manage having a 3-year-old at home. You know, it's not easy to manage having a 3-year-old at home that has a virtual Zoom schedule with their teacher. You know, they're not able to necessarily put those Zoom codes in for themselves and set themselves up. So some families just really needed the childcare support because their situation at home was just so complex to manage. And then we had families where, you know, their perspective was just, my child needs socialization. Like, being at home is just not working for my child. It's just not a healthy situation. I can see that my child is suffering developmentally because they need that social interaction and they need those relationships with their teachers and the wider situation to their family. So once we had that information in place and once we had our initial pods in place, we would be able to begin reopening. And I think one of the main things that we refer back to was this idea of social distancing. And that was the kind of guiding factor of opening slowly and opening in these small pods. And I think that was a decision that was really a decision that was right for the children and was just really about the safety for the children as well, because social distancing for children is not safety to them. Relationships are safety to children. Play is safety to children. Freedom is safety to children. Being able to reflect with your peers about your relationships and your play and your freedom, that's what's safety to children. Not telling children continually, move away from each other. You're not being safe by being too close to each other. You know, this is not safety for children. These children have gone through a situation that we can only really describe as a crisis for them, and their tiny lives that they've had so far. You know, 3 months out of the life of a 3-year-old is a really significant chunk of their life. And, you know, they really needed that support of feeling safe and feeling secure. So for us, we just felt that that safety and secure comes through freedom and comes through relationships with each other.
And I'd say that, you know, something that I pick up from this as well, and we often talk about how critical listening and reflection is in sort of every aspect of the design of a program, the selection of materials. You know, we've had a chance, you know, we're talking all the time for the last few years, we're talking on a regular basis. And, you know, we talked a lot about what it looked like during shelter in place, when children were at home and you were connecting online. But you see that the connection between creating spaces where you're listening to and understanding the needs of children before they come back, and how that information, both you can provide information based on what you knew about the children to the family so they can respond to their needs. But in coming back, you also have been in this position where over those months that you were closed, you were listening to what their needs were so that you could respond in the opening up based on the actual situation of each individual child. So that practice of listening, of reflection, of creating space for children to share. So, you know, if you had spent a month or 2 months sheltering in place, doing scavenger hunts and sing-alongs and, you know, other sort of teacher-defined activities, you wouldn't have that information about what those children needed when they were coming back to school. And so I think that, just off topic a little bit, we've been working together on sort of second stage guidance for schools and for families, and we're going to put that out again for free very soon, which will include guidance around how to use Zoom or other video chatting software to maintain that connection between the child and the family and the school, and how that integrates into what's going to be happening at the school. So I just wanted to bring that out, that process of listening and reflection continues in every aspect of that relationship, and the value that comes from having authentic knowledge about the child informs even the technical details of what an environment looks like. And I know you're talking about the health and safety requirements, and those are really critical. And I think we also just, we're very cautious about making specific recommendations around that, because, every place is so different. And as you said, you have to really look at what local, regional, national laws and specifications are. But yeah, I think obviously safety is also physical safety, the health and safety of children. But I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about what this experience has been like now that you have these children back. What does it look like when you're providing a space for children to be heard and seen, and have that freedom when they're coming from disparate situations back together again, right? From being distributed across different places and coming back to a single environment that you have a say over what it looks like.
Yeah, what does that transition look like, Emma?
Yeah, it's been a really complex process. I don't want it to sound like it's been this simple process at all, because we're actually in a situation now where the government announced that we could open up more widely. So we were able to offer more family spaces on site. And we're now in a situation where we've got around 45 children on site, and they're still in small pods, of course, but we were able to grow those pods. So those pods of children went from 5 to around 7 or 8. But we've also got a situation where we've got 27 families who are still off-site. They're still virtual for us. So when we talked about things like safety, and when we talked about things like relationships, we were also thinking about those children. Like, what does that look like for those children who are still off-site? So it became this really complex parallel process of ensuring children on-site had those fundamental relationships, but also ensuring children off-site also continued to have those fundamental relationships. So we're kind of running things in parallel at the moment, because it's really important to consider that, when you go through a phase reopening, you are not bringing 100% of children on site in one go. So you have to really think about those steps that you take for those families that remain off-site. So I think I'll talk about that kind of connection between on-site and virtual first, and then I'll go into talking a bit more about what it looks like on-site for the children. But we've been doing lots of things to connect the children on-site with the children who are off-site. So making short videos for the children who are off-site with the children who are on-site in those videos. And that's brought a lot of joy to those children who are not on-site at the moment, so they can see their peers, they can hear their stories and see what they're doing. And that actually worked really well for one child whose parents wanted her back on site. But after spending so much time at home, she was really struggling with this idea of coming back on site. So we decided to make a short video for her, very specific to her, from the children in the group that she was going to be placed in, inviting her back. And it worked so well. So I'm just so grateful to this parent who suggested the idea, because surely enough, by Monday, this child was back on site. So we sent the video out on Friday. By Monday, this child was back on site, and she came through the gates with a beaming smile and didn't look back. So that was a really kind of special moment for that child to feel so welcomed back on site. And so we've really been trying to look at individual children's needs, and that was a really specific need of a child that was needed to be back on site because parents are returning to work, but she was so resistant because she had spent so much time at home, and she'd enjoyed that extra family time, and she'd found a new routine that was her new normal, and the reality of going back to school and a different normal again was quite scary for her. So we've been doing things like that to connect the children who are on site and the children who are off site, and also connecting the teachers. So we had to kind of go into a situation where the team became a split team. So we had an on-site team and a team that was still running things virtually for us. And that was quite a big decision to make, because it was a decision of who are those people who will be on site? Who are those people who will remain working virtually with the children? And basically the decision had to come around like which teachers are ready to make the children feel safe and secure. You know, which teachers are feeling emotionally safe and secure themselves because their own situations make them feel emotionally safe and secure. Because ultimately on that first day of opening the gates to the children, they need somebody confident, they need somebody strong, they need somebody who's ready to take on their emotional needs. So that needs to be somebody who has already been dealing with their own emotional needs around the whole situation of the pandemic. So we really looked at those key things between staff, and we had lots of conversations as a staff about who would be on site first, who needed just another week, who needed another 2 weeks. And then we kind of worked from there, ensuring that everybody, when they did come on site, felt kind of more safe and secure about the situation. And I think that initial team, it was an initial team of 4 of us that were kind of on the front line. But behind that 4 of us, there were like 10 other people on site making the facilities work. There was cleaning staff, cooking staff. So for 20 children in that first 2 weeks, we actually had 14 staff on site for 20 children. So when you kind of think about the amount of like effort that's gone into the background for 20 children to be on site, to make things safe, to make sure that cleaning protocols are being carried through in real great depth, to make sure that meals are being prepared in a way that is safe for the children. So it was a really kind of difficult process figuring out who those teams are going to be, who those people are going to be. But once we got to that point, I think it made those who were staying off site feel more confident because they could see how well the process was going. And once they felt more confident, they started to come on site as well. And then we were able to open more groups. We were able to open the situation much more widely to the families. And then just thinking back to your question, Jessie, about what this looks like for the children on site, I think just going back to this idea of safety and freedom, you know, children can arrive to school under all of these new and kind of strange and difficult protocols when there's in-depth preparation that goes on in the background for those children. So one of the first things that we did is we had a Zoom meeting with the families. So no children, just the families online with us. And we just talked about really clearly what all the health and safety protocols would be. And also which of those health and safety protocols were important to share with the children. Like, these are the things your child needs to know. Your child is going to arrive on Monday. Their teacher is going to greet them wearing a mask. You know, this is an important thing for a child to know, because if they arrive to that and they don't know it, then that's not safety for children. That's not feeling secure. So what we did is we actually shared some photographs of ourselves wearing masks with the children before they came into school. So we ran the Zoom meeting, shared in-depth information with the families, and then we shared these photographs of ourselves wearing masks so that they knew the faces that they were coming into. And I think that was an amazing suggestion. Again, that was a parental suggestion. So this has been a real, I think all along the way, we've really tried to make this a two-way process. Like, what are the parents' needs? What are the children's needs? What are the staff needs? And really kind of moving between different, the different needs of all of the people affected by this situation. So again, a parent suggested about the mask idea. And I just think that was such a great idea to introduce to children, you know, what they're going to be welcomed by, who they're going to be welcomed by, and what their teacher looks like in a mask. And then the other situation was that children were going to be greeted not necessarily by the teacher that they're familiar with from their school, the start of the school year. So we had to have, for some children, different adults. It wasn't as clear cut as this is the adult you met at the beginning of the school year who's been your safety for the school year to this point. It could be somebody quite different that you don't necessarily know as well as your class teacher, basically. But I think I mentioned this last time we talked, but we were in a really advantageous position because we're an open plan centre. So there wasn't a single situation where there was no relationship. Of course, relationships are always going to be stronger with key adults, and each group, you know, starts the year with 2 key adults, and those are always going to be the strongest relationships. However, the way that our centre works, children have opportunity for relationships with everybody. So we thought that process through as well, and we matched children to adults that we knew there was like a clear relationship and that they would be able to have a relationship to build on. So those were some of the things going on in the background to make children feel safe and secure and just know what's going to happen, what's the routine, who's going to greet me. What do I do when I greet my teacher? How do I transition from my parent? You know, because they are in a situation where parents can't come on site right now. So they have to transition from the car park. They have to walk around 2 meters from their parent to us in the morning. So all of this was really clear to the children before their first day of arrival. And I think one of the things that stands out to us so well was we were expecting like anticipation from the children. We were expecting, and we had all of these conversations with the parents on Zoom, like, what if my child just won't transition? And we said, well, you know, then we'll come a little bit closer and, you know, we'll just figure it out. We're going to make this work, right? Like, we're going to work together and we're going to make this work. And actually, when the first day arrived, the children were just like, almost running from their parents to come and greet us because they knew what they were coming into. And also, I think one of the things that they knew, because they've had so much time here with us before our situation of going into lockdown and transitioning to virtual school, they know the kind of freedom that awaits them behind those gates. And I think they were so excited to be back and be with peers and be within that kind of those boundaries of freedom where they know that they can, you know, make their own discoveries, work with peers to kind of discover things together, reflect on those experiences together. So I think we were surprised, I guess, at just how easily those children transitioned through the gates on that first day and just how joyfully they came in and how excited they were to share with us their stories from their weekend in the same way that they would have done 3 months ago. And yeah, I think that was kind of a really positive surprise for everyone. I think a positive surprise for us as the teachers and a positive surprise for the parents as well, that, you know, the mask just didn't matter. The temperature check just didn't matter. The lining up in a place they've never lined up in before didn't matter. Transitioning from their parent at the car park just didn't matter, because what mattered to them was that they're going to go back into an environment where they know what the rules are, they know what the expectations are, they know what kind of freedom awaits them. So yeah, it was a surprising transition for us.
And I think that, again, and you brought that up, that idea of clarity and a certain intentionality in the communication, which is the basis of relationships, right? Listening and responding. You know, parents' ideas are taken seriously and seen as important. And I think we can't overestimate the importance of the emotional state of the parent affecting the child's return to school. And so when parents are listened to, when they're heard, that can really affect that hour or the half hour in that car ride to school. That when the parent knows that their concerns are being heard, that decisions are reflecting their needs, that they feel that their ease, their child going back, is also an important part of how the child feels when they return to school. So again, I think, you know, something that we stress, whether it's work with parents, work with other teachers, the work of the center director with the teacher or the teacher with the child, is just the critical role of listening and reflection and responding to actual needs and moving away from lots of externally defined ideas about what teachers should be doing, what parents should be doing, what children should be doing, beyond simply listening and observing and creating that safety that you're talking about. So again, I think that that's something where you can create systems, right? As a teacher, as an educator, you can create a system for your class. You can create a system for your center. You know, if your center is part of a larger network of centers, you can create systems that are simply focused on listening and responding and reflecting, not lots of information being pushed out, not lots of ideas about what should or shouldn't be done for the learning of a child to be pushed out either on the child or on the teacher in the classroom or for the parent. But coming back to that basic notion of listening and reflection. And I think that's a powerful idea, because what we see in Anji, I think what we're seeing with your work, is that that can be part of larger systems, that it's not something that can only happen in a very small, individualized setting, that you can scale listening and reflection. And in fact, the more you pull away, the more complexity you pull out of that and come back to those simpler, more basic ideas, almost the faster and the more authentically it can scale. And in the scaling, if there's reflection and listening in the scaling, then the system just gets stronger as it grows. And so, you know, I think that comes back to something we were talking about at the beginning, which is sort of, what does an authentic approach to this practice look like? You know, we talk about your program as an Anji Play demonstration program. Probably the only Anji Play demonstration program outside of China. You don't have any Anji Play materials. you don't have materials from Anji. You know, your environment is not as huge and as natural as some of these beautiful schools that we see in Anji. But what we're hearing from you and what we've observed in the photos and videos and in the stories that you've shared with us, that you have taken that approach to listening, reflection, listening to the child's story first and almost exclusively before making decisions about the environment or about routines or about, you know, what you should be doing together as teachers. And that in your professional development, in your work together, it's again focused on coming together as a community of educators to talk about what you've heard, right? To discuss what you've seen, free from assumptions about what children should be doing or what they should be learning or how to contextualize it within a more complicated theoretical framework. That you're coming back to the simple sort of remit of what does it look like to listen to and then reflect on these experiences. And so I'm really curious, and I know that we've had a chance to talk about this before we started broadcasting, and we've seen it in some of the things that you've shared with us internally. Also, you know, we're part of this larger group of about 20 educators that comes together on a monthly basis to reflect on our practice of Anji play and our understanding of true play. What is that? What are you hearing and seeing in the children's play? What does having children tell their own stories first and have their own stories be heard first? What is that looking like right now for you? I'm really curious. Is there any examples you can share?
Yeah,
What is the
sure.
power? Is
Yeah.
there any power in that now in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I would quite like to share before we go into that is just like some of the things we noticed. So obviously we opened the gates, children came on site, and there was some really key things we noticed about children's development in that first week. So one of the key things we noticed is some regression with children's physical development. There was a lot more ice packs in that first week. There was a lot more, we had a WhatsApp group with the nursing, because obviously if you're functioning in a room alone with your small pod, like you need your contact. So the nurse was in the WhatsApp and, you know, she had to come down and be WhatsApped and bring an ice pack down. And this was the reality of it. So, you know, children were having more accidents because they were trying to do the things that they knew they could do in our environment before the lockdown. So basically they were creating these balancing structures that should have been sturdy, but there was mistakes in their balancing structures. They were stacking these crates and there was imperfections in the way that they were stacking them. So things were wobbling, things were tipping, and, you know, they were having a few bumps and scrapes. Like, nothing major, you know, we haven't had any major injuries in our environment since we started working with Anji Play, basically. But just these little bumps and scrapes that the children were getting that they just wouldn't have got before. So there was some physical development regressions that we were noticing. And then also we were really noticing some regressions with children's social and emotional skills as well, because they've been alone. Lots of these children have spent time alone, or they've spent time just with siblings where the relationship is different. You know, it's older peers. Generally for children in our environment, they have elder peers or much younger peers that they don't necessarily have the same play interactions with, or they've just been with parents because they're an only child. So their social interactions at first were challenging for them. You know, they didn't really know how to kind of work on a problem together or build a structure together. So there was, in that first week, there was lots of independent play within the environment. So they weren't necessarily playing in a social way. Or if they were playing in a social way, there was a lot more conflict than we would have experienced before. And I think, you know, all of the staff that I work with here are extremely comfortable with conflict, and they're extremely comfortable with stepping back and allowing children the space and the freedom to solve their own conflict. But we were having to be really, you know, observant and figure out what the conflict was, you know, what was going on in the conflict for the children, and, you know, not stepping into their space of conflict, because, you know, children do need to solve their own conflicts. They need that space and they need that feeling of competency that comes alongside solving their own problems with peers. But we had to observe a lot, and we had to observe carefully, and we had to kind of just, you know, really remember that stance of stepping back, because when it's happening more frequently, it certainly gets you more nervous, right? It certainly makes you feel more on edge about the situation when you've got a conflict popping up here and here, and you're kind of like, well, which conflict do I observe? And I'm talking about a group of 5 children, you know, so the dynamics in those groups was really interesting to observe at first. And also from that then kind of emerged this desire for a best friend within the group. You know, we've all observed young children really want that best friend within the group. And when there's only 5 children in a group, that's two pairs and somebody not involved in that process. So there was also lots of, I wouldn't describe it as mean behavior, because that's just not the right way to describe it, because children just don't interpret it in that way. That's very much an adult interpretation of the context. But just, you know, like, you're not playing with us, like, we are best friends. So we observed a lot of that kind of dynamic as well between the children. And then by sort of week 3, they emerged as this amazing group of 5. They stuck together like glue. They did everything together. And that was very much happening within all of the pods that we were observing, that there was these kind of really tight relationships that had emerged and developed, and their play was very much together, and they were doing lots of things as a group. And then, of course, we went to pods of 8, and that just kind of tipped the whole balance of the group again. So we had to almost go through that whole dynamic all over again. And children figuring out relationships, because that's what children do. They figure out relationships with each other. So we feel like we've done a lot of observing of, you know, situations of conflict, children figuring out relationships, children figuring out use of materials together. But ultimately, I think because we have that stance of stepping back, the children have been able to kind of negotiate this for themselves. They haven't felt like, you know, the adults are making decisions about who's friends with who. They haven't felt like adults are making decisions with how they build their structures, which problems they solve, because they have full ownership of all of those things. And I think, although it's felt tangled and a bit messy at times, more messy than it would normally feel in the kind of situation where children flow between different friendships and flow between different scenarios and situations throughout their day. So although it's felt more messy and tangled than that, we've really observed so much joy from the children, so much joy from the adults as well, through that observation of the children's joy, and just almost a process of healing for everybody, you know, going through this process of everybody's starting to get better a little bit from this crisis that we've been through. And, you know, the adults are healing because they're observing the children having so much joy, and the children are healing because they're able to interact again. And although that interaction's messy sometimes, that's childhood. And, you know, childhood isn't this linear process of, you know, everybody's friends with everybody all of the time and everybody wants to solve the same problem all of the time and there's no conflict. That's just not what childhood is about. But I think we've observed a much more intense version of those usual processes that we observe on a regular school term kind of thing, or a regular kind of integration back into school.
So just to clarify for people, particularly teachers and parents that are listening, while that was taking place in play or even in the classroom, teachers were not stepping in and saying, oh, can you share that? Can you say that differently? Have you thought about how that makes Janie feel? Were you guys doing any of that?
That's not something that we generally do. I mean, I think that's something ever since we started working with you and Christina, you know, and going out to Angie to observe and talking to teachers in Angie and talking to people within our study group, you know, that's just not something that we do. It's much more about allowing the children space to solve conflict. And actually, sometimes what we perceive as conflict doesn't even matter to the children. When they come to do their play story, their reflection on their play or their play sharing, where they talk about their play as a group, rarely do they highlight the things that we see as conflict. They highlight the joyful things. They highlight the materials. They highlight the problems that they solve together. So yeah, I think it's maybe a good time to kind of share a few photographs that kind of express some of the joy that we've seen. I have chosen photographs quite carefully that don't show children's faces, so you don't necessarily see joy in the faces. But I think the play stories that I will share, those reflections from the children, kind of highlight some of those joys from the children's discoveries.
And before we get to that,
oh, sorry, Jess.
No, please, Christina, please.
Something that I was thinking about too, as you're talking about this, Emma, is that that's being highlighted for me is the tremendous trust you have in children. You trust that they are going to be able to solve their problems. You trust that they are going to learn things. You trust that they know exactly the types of problems they should be solving and want to be solving, and you give them the time and space for that. I think that we see that missing in so many programs that we visit, right? You see teachers guiding and directing, because at the end of the day, they say they trust children, but they don't. they don't give them the time, they don't give them the space, they don't give them the opportunities to do these things on their own and really follow their own leads. We always have these adult interpretations or expectations of where they should go next. And if we don't really step back, we can't really start to build the trust with them, and we can't see how capable and competent they truly are. So yeah.
And I think again, also,
clear.
and I think that, you know, you brought up this idea that children aren't really mean, right? That children are figuring out how to co-regulate each other. They've been in spaces, and, you know, as a parent of a 5.5-year-old in day 95 of shelter in place, you know, I can't co-regulate her the way a peer would co-regulate her, right? That trusting that children aren't mean people, that they're not trying to hurt each other, but that they're working things out. And I guess the reason I asked that question is because I want to be like super, super explicit, because I think sometimes we take for granted that people understand from what we're saying that as teachers or as parents or as adults around children, that we are not doing those things. We are not saying, how did so-and-so make you feel? How do you feel about that? Can you tell him how you felt? Can you work on sharing that better? Can you use your word? Here is a strategy for you, child, to talk about some conflict that to me makes me uncomfortable, right? So I asked that question just because I want to be super, super explicit that in your program, you're not going in moments of play and asking children to reconsider their actions or their words. And that in group times, when they're together in the classroom, you're not going over things that you perceive as important social emotional things that you want them to talk about in a certain way or learn how to process or describe in a certain way. So that's why I put that out there, because I think our lesson is that we need to be explicit about these things.
And I think that what's really important though is that that by stepping back, it's not that the teacher doesn't have a role at the school and with the children. It's a different type of role. It's creating that freedom so that their abilities are really being shown, and then creating that time and space for that reflection where if they want to process it, they want to work it out, they want to talk about it with their peers, it's available, but it's not forced upon them. Again, it's all we want anything that the children are doing or thinking about or talking about to come from like in a place of intrinsic motivation or something that they're really curious about or really want to be grappling with, instead of, again, these adult enforced expectations or ideas that we think are really important for the children to be exploring.
Yeah, I think often our lens is just so narrow about these things, right? And I think only by stepping back, you can kind of broaden that lens. And I've seen my team here over the last 3 years really go through that process of when you do take that stance of stepping back, like how much your mind shifts. Like my colleague and I had a conversation this morning that I'll share a little bit more about shortly, because I have a kind of a reflection on that. But yeah, just when you do take that stance of stepping back, how much you change as an educator, you change so much. And I think we've gone through a significant process of change over the last 3 years. And I think that process of change has really supported us through this whole situation and kind of how we've planned. First of all, how we had to plan virtually for our children, but then also how we've planned this transition with some children coming back on site and some children still being off site. One particular child who's currently off site at the moment and still working virtually with us, you know, he is very schedule orientated. Schedules are extremely important to him. And I was talking to Gillian this morning, one of my colleagues, about him, and he basically wanted to know not only his own schedule, but he wanted to know the schedules of the other children. And Gillian was curious, like, why is he so motivated to know the schedules of the other children? And his motivation was that he wanted to join the schedules of those other children. He wanted to see what they were up to. So Gillian made space for that. She listened to his need and she made space for that to happen. You know, and if she hadn't stepped back and listened to what his need was virtually, you know, she wouldn't have been able to create that space for him. And it turned out there were certain peers that he was missing from different groupings, that he wanted to know what they were doing. He wanted to see their faces. So she really kind of created the time and created the space for that to happen.
And I think, I'm really excited to see the photos, to see the reflections, to hear more. But the last thing I just wanted to put in there before I mute myself again is, again, you're talking about stepping back and listening and being present. So again, stepping back is not disappearing. It's not checking. Stepping back is not checking out. Stepping back is not the adult going off somewhere to work on their lesson plans or have a coffee or talk to another teacher about, what was going on last night, at home, right? That stepping back is giving space, but there's that presence of hearing and listening and observing that I think it's critical to come back to again, because we do see some approaches to free play, which is like the adult is bad, they shouldn't be there, just get out of the way and let the kids do whatever they want. And of course that is better than, a highly controlled academic sort of all about adult needs situation. But we're talking about something, and you're talking about something, which is much more about stepping out of the child's space, but being there. And I think anybody who's seen photos or videos of teachers in Anji, or the photos and videos that they produce, that there is a depth of observation, of being present, of making recordings, creating documents or evidence of what's taking place.
And there's a genuine curiosity about children, and not making the assumption that you already know children because you've taken all these classes on child development. Like, who is that child right in front of you, and what are they showing you in that moment, and capturing that? And also, what message is that sending to the child that you're watching, that they're the most important thing right now, that what they're doing is extremely interesting, it's important, it should be valued. And to me, that's actually more valuable than the teacher stepping in and trying to put in their own interpretation of that. Right? Because that's about the teacher, it's not about the child. What the child is doing in that moment is the most important. They're showing you that. And so if you can be a part of that moment by deeply observing what they're doing, I feel like there's no greater form of respect.
And I think, Emma, you described, you and your colleague, the joy of that discovery, right? That the child is discovering the world, and there's this joyous experience for an adult, for an educator, to discover what the child is capable of, and how much more informed our decisions are about a child or about the environment when they come from that place of discovery, of our joyous knowledge of what children are capable of.
Okay. Should I share my screen? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Hopefully it's going to work perfectly, but let me know if there's an issue. Can you see it? Fantastic. Okay.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. So basically, in Budapest this week and over the last couple of weeks, we've had a significant amount of rain. As you can see in this picture, we've been having some crazy thunderstorms involving hailstones. But of course, like, one of our kind of guiding things is that we go out in all weathers. And there's just so much joy for children in playing in the rain. So you can see two children have created a structure for themselves. And that's kind of like the adult's initial observation. And I'm there documenting through video recording, through photographs. And of course, I'm curious. Like, my curiosity is like, what are the children going to tell me about this later? Not, I'm going to go over there and I'm going to ask you what you're doing, because that's just not the stance that we're taking as an Anji Play educator. We're taking the stance of, I'm observing you, I'm interested in you, I'm close to you, but I'm just close enough that I'm not in your space. I'm just close enough that I can document what you're doing because I respect and value what you're doing. And I'm so interested to find out about what you're doing later. And I always love it when the thing that I've been documenting is the thing that children talk about in their play story, because it just kind of comes together so nicely, because I'm like, oh, now I know deeply what it was that you were trying to share today or trying to achieve today. So this is actually my son in the yellow rain jacket. So he's in my group at the moment, which has been a really interesting dynamic to have, like, mummy and teacher in the same role. But we've been navigating it and kind of figuring it out between us. And this is one of his really good friends. And these two are always together. They met in August and they really didn't part much other than the 3 months we were home. So here they are. And this is their reflections. So these are the reflections of 3-year-old children playing outside in the big muddy puddles. We put the ladder and jumped in muddy puddles. You know, this is a very, what I would describe as a very concrete reflection on the situation. You can see the ladder over here. You can see the tray they were jumping into. You can see the splashes, right? So it's a very kind of concrete reflection of a situation. And this is his peer, really similar. But I love this because you can see the motion in his picture. You know, you can see the direction that they were traveling in their kind of play together. So that was just a really joyful discovery for those two very young children. And that was after just a few days of reconnecting with each other. And then this one, on a slightly drier day, this group of children had been together. There was another girl, but she was kind of to the side and didn't quite get captured in the photograph. So this was when we were a pod of 5, and when children were really engaging together as their pod of 5, and their play was very much at that point where they were just like stuck together like glue in their pod of 5, and they did everything together. And these children were really exploring sliding. So they were sliding on the hill. It was very much kind of a rough and tumble type play. They were pulling each other, they were pushing each other. They were really having a lot of fun in this play together. And there was just so much like joy, so much laughter. And often that's, you know, what we gravitate to when we're observing. We gravitate, where's the joy, where's the laughter? Like, what do we want to feel joyful in discovering with the children? And you can see that this was such a meaningful experience to one of these children that they actually turned their play story into the shape of the hill. And, you know, that's very intentional, to go and seek out a pair of scissors to actually draw the shape of the thing that you were discovering that day. So I really love just seeing children's play stories. And I think these photographs and these play stories are just going to be such special memories for these children. You know, these are the play stories from when they emerged from this situation together. And then another rainy day. So you can see that there's, again, it's like it's rough and tumble play. This play involved a lot of bumping into each other, a lot of rolling over. And for me as an observer, what I was observing was just like, okay, these children are sliding on the slides. It's wet today. They're going faster. They're enjoying that feeling of going faster. Of course, what I don't know until we reflect together later are the kind of depth and complexity of that play. And here's a play story from one of the children, and I don't know if you can see it because of the view of us in the corner, but actually what they were playing, and this was drawn in the play story, but was actually discussed during some play sharing where we looked at videos and photographs together. And they were actually playing that they were at a water park, and they were basically playing on water slides. So it wasn't the concrete situation that you think you're observing. There's always so much more depth and, you know, so much more complexity to what you see with your just naked eye, basically, when you're observing children. And you can hear things, of course, when you're observing children. You hear the dialogue between them, but until you actually sit down with them and let them draw this play out or watch videos of this play and describe this play, you just don't know the depth of the child's story. And I think that's one of the things since working with Angie Play is that, you know, that's our main focal point is what's the child's discovery? What is the child's story about their play? And that story comes before any other story. And it comes way before the story that we want to tell about the play. Even though, you know, you build up these preconceptions about what children are doing when you're observing them, you genuinely don't know what the play is really about until you hear it from their perspective. And often what happens when we do play share together, children have different perspectives of what the play was about as well. So sometimes they, you know, there's differences in what they're seeing from the play as well between the group that played together. And this is a reflection on the same play. So this is a reflection of the same play. And you can almost see the kind of navigation through the water park that this child is taking and all of the different kind of turns and twists that they take within the water park. So I think I'll just stop sharing my screen there. And then just go back to the reflection that Agata shared with me just earlier before we met tonight. She has a group of children, so she was in her pod of 5. They were functioning within their pod of 5 quite harmoniously, I guess she would describe. And then some new children came into that group and it changed the balance, of course, because that's what happened when children come into a situation where they're kind of new to the group or perceived as new to the group. And yesterday she was observing them play together and they were really engaging in rough and tumble play. And she said it was, for her, it was quite uncomfortable, actually. She was observing and she was kind of thinking, oh my goodness, like, do I step in? Like, is this too much for the children involved? Like, for her as an observer, it felt like it was too much. And she kind of continued to take that stance of stepping back. And she saw the play change. And she saw the faces of the children change, and she saw the joy on the children's faces. And then she realized that that again was just her perspective of the play. It wasn't the children's play, the children's perspective on the play. So what they did later when they came back into the room is she shared the video footage that she'd been capturing of this play. And basically she engaged the children in a reflective discussion. And the children talked about like the joy. They laughed so much at the video. They thought the videos were like the funniest thing they'd ever seen. And they were just like laughing out loud. And they had this whole discussion about rough and tumble play. And when you play together in that way, what the rules are. So to Argota, it looked chaotic. To the children within the play, it wasn't chaos at all. There was rules, there was guidelines, there was things you had to abide by if you were in that play. So the children really articulated really clearly what that play meant to them. And it was very different to the perspective that Argota was taking. And one of the things she reflected with me about was, you know, if we hadn't been doing this work with Angie Play, I'd have been in there, I'd have stopped that play, and I would have actually disrupted that joy for those children. But I think there's something deeper in that Argota reflected on as well. And I think that is about those children needed that play. They needed that play to kind of figure out their roles within the group. And she said that the next day after that play, the group dynamic shifted and changed, and the relationships were different, and the relationships were actually better within that group. So I think some really quite deep reflections from Argota about how those children, you know, engaged with each other, and how she had to really take that stance of stepping back and really hold herself in that stance in order to allow the children's play to go through that natural trajectory. And in order for them to be able to reflect back on those experiences together.
And I guess I have just a clarification too. So when you're saying that the children made the rules, I can see like in many situations like this, the teacher would actually facilitate or guide it or kind of encourage the conversation to go in that direction. Do you mind talking about how Argota approached it, or if you might not know because you weren't there, but if you, in similar situations around conflict, can you talk about how you as a teacher are holding space, and like, what are you doing? Are you bringing up like, we should make rules about this? Like, what does that look like when you're guiding that reflective process?
I mean, I think one of the key fundamentals of guiding that reflective process is not having a preconceived idea about what you want to discuss with the children. The discussion has to emerge from them. So basically, just asking clarifying questions to the children, you know, asking them some questions like, you know, just tell me more about that. Like, how was that for you? But not guiding them down a certain agenda. I think that's a mistake that, you know, many people fall into that trap of, I've got this agenda that I hold on to because I think that there's a right way to do this, or there's a right way to rough and tumble with each other. You know, what does an adult know about the right way to rough and tumble together is? It's like the last time I rough and tumble played, I was probably about 10, right? So I don't know the rules of rough and tumble play anymore. I can't decide those rules anymore. It's about what the children feel in that particular scenario. And every scenario is different. So you can't preconceive an idea about a situation. It has to come from the children. It has to be their story. I think the initial point is just hearing from their perspective, hearing their story, and making that the fundamental starting point of the conversation. And then once that story comes out, ensuring that your voice does not take over their story, that as the conversation is guided, it remains their story.
And I think, you know, we're really lucky. I think June 30th, we're going to have Larry Cohen, Dr. Larry Cohen, join us for a True Play check-in. And so much of his work is focused on the relationship between rough and tumble play and children's social and emotional health. But something that I think Christina is bringing up, and I'm also hearing from your description, and this comes back to, again, I think, really listening to what we're hearing out there, or people that see Angie Play and talk about doing it. That, you know, we hear a lot of people say like, oh, we've got lots of play, you know, we just need some ladders, we just need some barrels. And of course, the most fundamental aspect of Angie Play is stepping back and allowing children to play. But oftentimes the biggest difference we see is actually what's going on inside, what's happening in the classroom. And so we hear, we just need some ladders, but then my question is, well, what's happening in your circle time? How are you talking about what's going on? And that's oftentimes, again, where that stepping back ends, right? Where once we're inside, now it's the teacher's space, and now it's the time for the lesson. And you can dress it up and make it look as authentic as possible. But when the idea about what the children should be talking about comes from the adult in a implicit or explicit way, again, that question of safety, that question of trust. Is it safe for the child to talk about things that they've learned that the teacher doesn't want them to learn? Are they trusted to talk about the rules or not talk about is the trust and is the safety continued from the trust and safety to play the way they want to play to the trust and safety to tell the stories they want to tell about what their experience was and what it meant to them? And again, that's something that you don't see very often, even in play-based programs, even in programs where there is a lot of lip service played to the authenticity of the experience of the child. It's sort of, how does the child authentically experience what we want the child to be experienced or saying or thinking? And so again, just to make it as explicit as possible, that when you're in your classroom, that's the space for the child to bring up what has happened for them, what's going on from them. And there isn't an urge to quickly summarize and then move on to how. It's not to pick and choose what a child is saying to prove the point that you want to have made for the child so that their experience can look more like how you think it should look, or so that their trajectory of inquiry looks more like what you think an important discovery looks like for the child. You're not looking at an argument and then looking at different books and then creating a 2-week lesson plan on how to talk about mud, right? That maybe the kids are talking about ice cream and not mud. And so the qualities of mud aren't important for them to be introduced to in a formalized setting indoors. And I know it's very late there, and you're braving thunder and lightning, and you're still at work. So
in time, yeah, luckily it stopped in time.
yeah. So I mean, if there's anything else you want to share, again, we encourage people to go to the various websites that we've put out there: trueplayfoundation.org, anjiplay.com. anjiplay.org. There's a lot of information there. These interviews are going to stay free and available. We're going to be sending out a new newsletter soon that's going to have a lot of this information in it. We're going to be putting out more guidance that we've been working on together about what that parallel looks like between children not being at school, maintaining that relationship, the role that technology can play in providing for and listening to children's needs and families' needs. So I don't know if there's anything you want to share. It's late there for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think just a final reflection really is just going back to the idea of looking, if you are going through a process of reopening, looking at that idea, like what do the legalities say? Because obviously you have to start with that. Then what's happening internationally in terms of best practice? We did look at kind of the Danish model and what was happening there. And we took inspiration from what was happening in Anji. And we kind of really looked at what would be best practice. And then we kind of narrowed that down to what we could potentially do here. But I think ultimately just going back to like, what is in the best interests of the child? What are the needs of the children as they re-enter into their spaces? And how do we prepare children for what to expect in their new reality? Because it might not look exactly like it looked before. And I think it's just making sure that that time for preparation is factored in, and that decisions aren't rushed into. Obviously, everything happens on a timeline. We were on a very short timeline in terms of having to make things happen, but not missing out any of those steps that would ultimately in the long term make children unsafe about returning to school. So making sure all of those steps are in place, basically, so that children feel safe and confident and comfortable and happy, and also that staff do and families do as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma.
Thank
It's been
you.
wonderful to talk to you as always.
Yeah, amazing work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for continuing to put the child first and to keep their all of their safety, whether it's their physical, mental, their just general well-being at the forefront of all the work that you're doing. I feel like, that is oftentimes lost, especially in times like these where there's, different agendas from different people and lots of different pieces to keep in mind when creating a plan. So it's always inspiring to hear how you're just so wonderful at making sure that the children and their voices are represented first in situations that, really should put them first. So, yeah, thank you, Emma.
Thank you.
Thank you.